March 8th, 1944. The Chindwin River, Burma. The water is cold as Private Sato of the 33rd Division struggles to keep his footing on the slippery riverbed. Around him, thousands of men move like ghosts in the moonlight, the silence broken only by the splashing of boots and the lowing of cattle. These animals are walking rations, vital for feeding an army on the move. Sato tightens the strap of his Type 99 rifle, feeling the heavy jungle humidity. He looks ahead toward the dark mountains of the Indian frontier. Unaware he is stepping into a massive graveyard, Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi watches the crossing with a swelling sense of destiny from his headquarters in Mamio. He is possessed by a singular vision, convinced the British Empire is a rotting structure waiting to collapse. His strategy, the Yugo offensive, relies on speed and audacity rather than traditional logistics. He ordered his men to carry food for 20 days, believing they will capture British supply dumps in Imphal before their rice runs out. Mutaguchi dismisses the concerns of his subordinates regarding the terrain, viewing their caution as a lack of fighting spirit rather than tactical prudence. The path ahead is not a road but a green nightmare of bamboo thickets and elephant grass that towers over the marching infantry. The Japanese 15th Army is attempting to move 3 entire divisions through some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth without heavy transport trucks. Soldiers like Sato are beasts of burden, carrying nearly 100 pounds of gear, ammunition, and rice on their backs. They hack their way through vegetation that seems to grow back the moment it is cut, while the steep mountain tracks turn into mudslides under the hooves of the supply oxen. Across the border, Lieutenant General William Slim of the British 14th Army is not asleep at the wheel. Unlike the disorganized retreat of 1942, the British forces are now preparing a calculated trap for the invaders. Slim knows that the Japanese rely on captured supplies to sustain their offensive momentum. Instead of meeting them in the jungle where the Japanese light infantry excels, Slim plans to pull his forward units back to the Imphal plain. He intends to fight on his own terms, forcing Mutaguchi to extend his supply lines until they snap under the weight of the monsoon rains. As the Japanese columns push deeper into Manipur, the initial clashes are savage. At Sangshak, the Indian Parachute Brigade faces the Japanese 31st Division in a desperate holding action. The Japanese soldiers charge with terrifying screams, hurling grenades and engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat with bayonets. Despite heavy casualties, the Japanese advance seems unstoppable to the defenders. The momentum of the Imperial Army is fueled by desperation, as every soldier knows that victory is the only way to eat. They overrun outposts and capture small caches of supplies, falsely confirming Mutaguchi's reckless gambling strategy. The cracks in the plan begin to show before the first major battle is even joined. The Genghis Khan strategy of driving cattle through the mountains proves to be a disaster in the dense jungle. Many oxen slip off the narrow trails, plummeting into the ravines below, along with the precious artillery shells and rice strapped to their backs. Other animals succumb to exhaustion or are slaughtered early by hungry troops who cannot wait for the capture of British rations. The 15th Army bleeds its resources dry just to reach the battlefield, leaving a trail of carcasses behind them. By early April, the leading elements of the Japanese 31st Division emerge from the jungle to see the Naga village of Kohima perched on a ridge. It sits across the vital road that links the supply base at Dimapur to the besieged forces in Imphal. The Japanese troops are exhausted and ragged, but their spirits soar at the sight of the objective. They believe that one final push will secure the road and grant them supplies they desperately need. Mutaguchi's gamble seems to be paying off as the British perimeter tightens. But the easy victory they expect is a mirage. The stage is now set for one of the most brutal confrontations of the Pacific War. Inside the defensive box at Kohima, a small garrison of British and Indian soldiers digs in, aware they are the only thing standing between the Japanese army and the undefended plains of India. Outside the wire, thousands of Japanese soldiers sharpen their bayonets, driven by the dual motivations of imperial duty and gnawing hunger. The march is over, and the slaughter is about to begin. The Road of Bones has claimed its first victims, but the true horror is yet to unfold. The sleepy hill station of Kohima has transformed into a hellscape of churned earth and shattered trees by the second week of April 1944. 944. What was once a serene administrative outpost is now the cork in the bottle preventing the Japanese 31st Division from pouring into the Dimapur supply base. Inside the shrinking perimeter on Garrison Hill, Colonel Hugh Richards commands a motley collection of troops, including the Royal West Kents and the Assam Rifles. They are dug into foxholes that are barely deep enough to protect them from the relentless mortar fire raining down from the surrounding ridges. The air is thick with the acrid smoke of cordite and the sickeningly sweet stench of unburied corpses rotting in the tropical heat. The epicenter of this violence is the district commissioner's bungalow, specifically the asphalt tennis court adjacent to it. This rectangular patch of manicured ground becomes the stage for one of the strangest and most savage infantry engagements of the entire war. The British defenders are dug in on one side of the court, occupying the clubhouse and the water tank, while the Japanese troops have burrowed beneath the bungalow itself on the opposite baseline. The distance between the enemies is less than the length of a tennis court, creating a claustrophobic nightmare where insults are shouted across the net and death is instantaneous. Combat on the tennis court devolves into a primitive duel of grenades and bolt-action rifles at point-blank range. During the day, Japanese snipers watch the British positions with hawk-like intensity, putting a bullet through any helmet that rises above the mud parapet. At night, the terrifying silence is broken by the screaming waves of Japanese infantry launching banzai charges across the open court. The British soldiers respond with Bren guns and Lee Enfield rifles, firing until their barrels glow red-hot in the darkness. The tennis court becomes carpeted with the bodies of the fallen, building a gruesome rampart that the living use for cover as the battle rages on without pause. Water becomes more precious than ammunition for the besieged defenders on Garrison Hill as the Japanese cut the main supply pipe. The only source of hydration is a small spring located in no man's land, accessible only under the cover of darkness and at great risk. Men crawl on their bellies through the mud, dragging jerrycans while tracer rounds zip overhead like angry hornets. The lack of water leads to severe dehydration and exhaustion. Yet the defenders hold their ground with a grim determination. They know that if Kohima falls, the Japanese will seize the massive stockpile of food and fuel at Dimapur, effectively winning the campaign. While the battle for the tennis court consumes the 31st Division, a similar crisis unfolds 40 miles south at Imphal. The Japanese 15th and 33rd Divisions have encircled the Imphal plain, cutting off the 14th Army's 4 Corps from the rest of the world. Lieutenant General Geoffrey Scoones pulls his divisions back into a defensive box, relying on the superior firepower of his tanks and artillery to smash the Japanese attacks. The Japanese soldiers, expecting to capture British rations within days of their arrival, are instead met with walls of steel. They throw themselves against the Allied lines in suicidal waves, driven by officers who refuse to acknowledge the failure of their tactical doctrine. The Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces become the lifeline that keeps the Allied defense from collapsing under the pressure. Dakota transport planes brave the treacherous mountain winds and Japanese anti-aircraft fire to drop supplies directly into the beleaguered garrisons. At Kohima, the drop zone on Garrison Hill is so small that pilots have to fly at treetop level to ensure the crates of ammunition and medical supplies do not drift into enemy lines. This aerial bridge denies Mutaguchi the quick victory he gambled on, turning the siege into a battle of attrition that Japan cannot hope to win. Inside the Japanese command tent, Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato of the 31st Division is realizing the magnitude of the betrayal by his superiors. His men are starving. Having exhausted the meager rations they carried over the Chindwin River weeks ago, Sato sends desperate radio messages to Mutaguchi demanding food and ammunition, only to receive orders to capture British supplies instead. The friction between the commanders turns into open hostility, with Sato realizing that his division is being sacrificed for a plan that has already failed. The soldiers on the front line are now fighting not just the British, but the gnawing pains of empty stomachs. The turning point at Kohima arrives in mid-April with the thunderous roar of engines from the Dimapur road. The British 2nd Division, rushing to the aid of the besieged garrison, smashes through the Japanese roadblocks with Grant tanks leading the way. The sight of the relief column brings tears to the eyes of the exhausted defenders who have held the line for 2 weeks of continuous combat. The tanks roll up the road and begin blasting the Japanese bunkers around the tennis court at point-blank range, turning the tide of the battle. The siege is technically broken. But the fighting for the ridge is far from over. Heroism becomes a daily occurrence amidst the squalor and terror of the siege lines. Lance Corporal John Harmon of the Royal West Kents immortalizes himself in the annals of military history during the desperate defense. Seeing a Japanese machine gun post pinning down his section, he charges it alone, destroying it with a grenade and bringing back the weapon. Later, he walks casually into open fire to silence another position that threatens his comrades, sacrificing his life to buy them time. These acts of individual bravery stiffen the spine of the defense, proving to the Japanese that the British soldier of 1944 is a far different adversary than the one they routed in 1942. As the month of April draws to a close, the Japanese offensive has stalled completely. Caught in a deadly trap of their own making, the British have held Imphal and relieved Kohima, transforming the defensive boxes into anvils upon which the Japanese army is being hammered. The Japanese troops are still dangerous, digging into the intricate tunnel systems of the surrounding peaks, but they are now the hunted rather than the hunters. The monsoon clouds are gathering on the horizon, promising a deluge that will wash away the roads and turn the battlefield into a swamp. Mutaguchi's window for victory has slammed shut, but he refuses to issue the order to withdraw. Lieutenant General William Slim stands before the situation map at his headquarters, a towering figure of calm amidst the storm of reports flooding in from the front. While Tokyo relies on the mystical concept of spirit to overcome material deficits, Slim relies on a cold calculation of logistics and firepower. He has successfully lured the Japanese 15th Army into the killing zones of the Imphal Plain, turning their aggression into their greatest weakness. The anvil of the defensive boxes has held firm against weeks of suicidal assaults. Now, Slim prepares to swing the hammer. He orders his reserve divisions to begin the counterstroke that will crush the starving Japanese forces against the hard steel of the British lines. The sky above the battlefield belongs entirely to the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces, a reality that terrorizes the Japanese infantry below. Hawker Hurricanes, affectionately known as Hurrybombers, scream down from the clouds to strafe exposed columns and blast bunkers with 20mm cannons. Unlike the Japanese Air Force, which has virtually vanished from the theater, the Allied pilots fly sortie after sortie with impunity. They act as the eyes of the artillery, spotting targets and correcting fire until Japanese positions are obliterated in geysers of mud and shrapnel. The psychological impact is devastating, as the Japanese soldier realizes there is no place to hide from the death raining from above. Logistics becomes the decisive weapon that tilts the balance irrevocably in favor of the 14th Army. While Mutaguchi's men scavenge for roots and lizards in the jungle, British and Indian troops receive regular rations of bully beef, tea, and ammunition. The C-47 Dakotas function as an endless conveyor belt in the sky, delivering over 400 tons of supplies every single day to the besieged garrisons. This aerial bridge does more than just feed the troops. It transports entire divisions, like the 5th Indian Division, directly into the heart of the battle. This strategic mobility allows Slim to reinforce threatened sectors in hours, a feat the Japanese cannot match on foot. The Japanese commanders are stunned by the appearance of heavy armor in terrain they deemed impassable for tanks. At the Battle of Nunshigum, a vital ridge overlooking the Imphal airstrip, the Japanese believe they are safe from armored assault due to the steep, jungle-covered slopes. They are proven wrong when M3 Lee tanks of the Carabiniers claw their way up the gradients, engines roaring and tracks churning the earth. The tanks blast the Japanese bunkers at point-blank range, their 75mm guns dismantling the defences piece by piece. Infantrymen of the Dogra Regiment follow close behind the steel beasts, clearing the shattered positions with bayonets and grenades. General Yanagida, commanding the Japanese 33rd Division south of Imphal, watches his forces evaporate against the Allied defences. He is a realist who recognizes that the operation has failed, yet he is bound by orders from a delusional high command. His soldiers possess no effective anti-tank weapons, forcing them to resort to desperate suicide tactics. Men strap satchel charges to their bodies and leap from the tall grass, attempting to disable the British tanks by blowing themselves up against the tracks. These human bullets cause localized damage but fail to stop the armored juggernaut, resulting only in the senseless waste of veteran lives. The admin box tactic, perfected by Slim in earlier engagements, proves to be the undoing of the Japanese infiltration strategy. Instead of retreating when surrounded, Allied units form tight defensive perimeters and stand their ground, relying on air supply to survive. The Japanese flow around these boxes like water around a stone, but they cannot penetrate them. By bypassing the boxes, the Japanese lengthen their own supply lines while leaving a fully armed enemy force in their rear. The hunters become the encircled, cut off from their own support, and slowly pounded into submission by artillery fire, directed from within the very boxes they tried to isolate. Inside the headquarters of the Japanese 15th Army in Mamio, the atmosphere is toxic with denial and misplaced blame. Lieutenant General Mutaguchi refuses to accept the reports of starvation and defeat coming from his frontline commanders. He views their requests for withdrawal not as tactical necessity, but as personal cowardice and a betrayal of the emperor. In a fit of rage, he fires General Yanagida and other senior officers who dare to speak the truth about the catastrophe unfolding in the jungle. Mutaguchi doubles down on his impossible orders, demanding that his skeletal troops capture Imphal immediately to secure the food they need to survive. The physical condition of the Japanese soldier deteriorates rapidly as the weeks of combat drag on without resupply. Malaria and dysentery begin to claim more men than British bullets, turning formidable battalions into hollowed-out shells. Soldiers are reduced to eating the leather straps of their equipment and boiling grass to fill their aching stomachs. The vaunted spiritual power that Mutaguchi preaches cannot sustain a man whose body is consuming its own muscle mass for energy. Discipline begins to fray at the edges, not from a lack of patriotism, but from the biological imperative of starvation that overrides all military training. By late June, the British counter-offensive begins to link up the isolated pockets of resistance. The 2nd Division, pushing down from Kohima, finally breaks through the Japanese roadblocks to meet the 5th Indian Division pushing up from Imphal. The handshake between the lead elements of these two forces at milestone 109 marks the end of the siege and the failure of the Yugo offensive. The road is open, and convoys of trucks laden with supplies begin to roll freely once more. The anvil has withstood the blow, and the hammer has swung down with crushing force. The Japanese 15th Army is now a broken force, but the order to retreat still does not come. Mutaguchi commands his men to hold their positions to the death, transforming the jungle into a vast, open-air prison. The monsoon rains, which had held off during the early stages of the battle, now begin to fall in earnest. The skies open up, turning the dusty tracks into rivers of mud and washing away the last hopes of the invaders. The British 14th Army prepares to pursue the retreating enemy, not knowing that the worst horrors of the campaign are yet to be discovered on the road back to the Chindwin. July 1944 brings a shift in the atmosphere that is more terrifying than any artillery barrage. The monsoon arrives not as a weather event, but as a geological force that fundamentally alters the nature of the war. The skies turn a bruised purple before unleashing torrents of water that do not stop for weeks on end. The dusty tracks that served as the lifeline for the Japanese 15th Army dissolve instantly into thigh-deep rivers of glutinous mud. Foxholes become swimming pools filled with a vile mixture of rainwater, excrement, and decomposing flesh. For the Japanese soldier, already weakened by months of malnutrition, the rain is the final nail in the coffin, stripping away the last shreds of hygiene and warmth. Inside the comfortable headquarters at Mamio, Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi remains hermetically sealed from the suffering of his men. He spends his days tending to his personal garden and performing religious ceremonies. Convinced that divine intervention will save his failing offensive, he refuses to look at the casualty reports that pile up on his desk, dismissing them as the exaggerations of weak-willed subordinates. When staff officers dare to suggest that the offensive is lost, Mutaguchi flies into violent rages, accusing them of disloyalty to the emperor. He issues orders that are entirely detached from reality, demanding that divisions which effectively no longer exist continue to attack fortified British positions. On the front lines, Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato of the 31st Division reaches a breaking point that is unprecedented in the history of the Imperial Japanese Army. His men are literally starving to death, with many unable to stand, let alone fight. Sato has sent repeated requests for the promised supplies, only to be told by Mutaguchi's staff that the Japanese soldier should be able to survive on his spiritual strength alone. When ordered to commit mass suicide by charging the British guns, Sato makes a fateful decision. He chooses to ignore the direct orders of his superior to save the lives of the men entrusted to his care. The radio waves between Meimyo and the front crackle with a level of insubordination that stuns the signal's intelligence officers listening in. Sato sends a blistering message to Army headquarters, stating plainly that Mutaguchi's incompetence is killing the division. He announces his intention to withdraw his forces to a position where they can find food, a move that is technically mutiny, punishable by death. Mutaguchi responds with threats of court-martial and execution, reminding Sato of his duty to the emperor. Sato retorts with a message that becomes legendary for its bitterness, claiming that the tactical ability of the 15th Army staff is inferior to that of cadets. The physical deterioration of the Japanese army accelerates rapidly as the command structure crumbles. Soldiers who have not eaten a proper meal in weeks begin to suffer from the horrifying effects of beriberi and acute starvation. Their bodies swell with fluid, their gums rot, and their vision fails, turning them into stumbling zombies. In the absence of rice, men resort to boiling leather belts, eating grass, and hunting for snakes or lizards in the flooding jungle. Discipline evaporates as the primal instinct for survival takes over. Officers can no longer command men who are too weak to lift their rifles. The army is not being defeated by the British, it is dissolving biologically. In a desperate attempt to restore order, Mutaguchi dispatches senior staff officers from the rear to the front lines to enforce his will. These officers, well-fed and clean in their crisp uniforms, are shocked by the skeletal apparitions they encounter in the mud. Instead of inspiring the troops, their presence incites hatred and despair. One staff officer, upon seeing the starving men, callously suggests they should shoot their rifles into the air to summon the spirit of victory to fill their bellies. Such incidents only serve to widen the chasm between the delusional high command and the soldiers who are paying the price for their arrogance in blood. The leadership crisis culminates in a purge that decapitates the 15th Army in the middle of a catastrophic defeat. In a move that signals total panic, Mutaguchi fires all three of his division commanders, Sato, Yanagida, and Matsuya. It is a desperate attempt to find scapegoats for his own strategic failures, but it only accelerates the collapse. The new commanders arrive to find units that exist only on paper. With equipment abandoned and morale non-existent, the chain of command is effectively broken, leaving junior officers and NCOs to make their own decisions about whether to fight and die or retreat and live. By the middle of July, the disorganized withdrawal begins spontaneously across the front, driven not by orders but by the collective collapse of the human body. Units simply melt away from the contact line, leaving behind their heavy weapons and their wounded comrades who cannot walk. The British 14th Army, sensing the slackening resistance, pushes forward cautiously, wary of traps. However, they find only abandoned bunkers filled with corpses and the debris of a defeated army. The Japanese soldiers are no longer fighting the enemy, they are fighting the jungle, the rain, and the vast distance that separates them from safety. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that the official order to retreat is delayed for weeks due to Mutaguchi's pride. He spends precious time arguing with his superiors in the Burma area army, refusing to admit that the Yugo offensive is a disaster. Every day of delay sentences thousands more men to death by starvation and disease. By the time the authorization to withdraw finally arrives, it is a hollow formality. The 15th Army has already ceased to function as a military organization. The survivors turn their backs on India and begin the long, agonizing stumble toward the Chindwin River, stepping onto a path that will soon earn its grim nickname. The disintegration of the 15th Army serves as a dark testament to the dangers of fanaticism over professionalism. The soldiers who marched out in March with high hopes of capturing Delhi are now broken scarecrows, betrayed by a leadership that viewed them as expendable ammunition. As they limp away from the Imphal plain, they leave behind not just their dreams of conquest, but their humanity. The rain continues to fall relentlessly, washing the blood from the battlefields but deepening the mud that will claim so many lives on the journey home. The fighting is over, but the dying has only just begun. The withdrawal of the Japanese 15th Army begins not as a military maneuver, but as a slow-motion descent into a primal struggle for existence. The path back to Burma lies through the Kabar Valley, a place notorious even in peacetime for its lethal climate and swarms of disease-carrying insects. Now, under the relentless hammering of the monsoon, it earns its dark moniker the Valley of Death. The rain does not fall in drops but in solid sheets that obscure vision and drown out all sound. It turns the jungle floor into a quagmire of sucking mud that grips the legs of starving men like wet concrete, demanding a Herculean effort for every single step taken toward safety. The physical environment attacks the soldiers with a ferocity that eclipses anything the British 14th Army could muster. The roads, which were barely dirt tracks to begin with, have completely dissolved into rivers of sludge waist-deep in places, trucks and artillery pieces, the pride of the Emperor's mechanized might, are abandoned where they sink, their axles swallowed by the earth. Desperate crews try to push them for miles, but as their strength fails, they leave the machines to rust in the downpour. The retreat becomes a foot slog for men who have already expended their last reserves of energy fighting on the Imphal plain. Disease thrives in this wet petri dish, spreading through the ranks with terrifying speed and efficiency. Dysentery becomes the great leveler of the army, stripping away rank and dignity until every man is reduced to a shivering, soiled wreck. Soldiers are forced to cut the seats out of their trousers because they lack the strength to stop and squat every few minutes. They march while relieving themselves, leaving a trail of bloody filth that infects those following behind. The humiliation of their condition is total. Yet the drive to keep moving overrides all shame, for to stop is to be left behind, to die alone in the mud. Malaria acts as the invisible sniper of the retreat, picking off men who have managed to survive bullets and starvation. Without quinine or mosquito nets, the soldiers are defenseless against the clouds of insects that rise from the stagnant pools. Men burn with fevers that reach 105 degrees, their bodies shaking so violently that they cannot hold their rifles. They alternate between burning heat and freezing chills, hallucinating images of home or feasts of rice while stumbling through the bamboo thickets. When they finally collapse, they often drown in inches of water, too weak to lift their heads from the puddles they fall into. The uniform of the Imperial Japanese Army, once a symbol of discipline and conquest, rots directly off the bodies of the wearers. Leather boots disintegrate in the constant moisture, forcing thousands to wrap their feet in rags or march barefoot over sharp rocks and leech-infested ground. The skin of the soldiers, constantly wet and rubbed raw by gear, develops tropical ulcers that eat quickly into the muscle and bone. Maggots infest these open wounds while the men are still alive, feasting on the necrotic flesh. The horror of seeing one's own body consumed by parasites drives many to the brink of insanity. Hunger remains the constant companion of the retreat, a gnawing void that dictates every action. The Churchill rations that Mutaguchi promised supplies captured from the British never materialized, and the Japanese logistics system has ceased to exist. Men scavenge the jungle floor like animals, eating raw snails, lizards, and monkeys if they can catch them. Some resort to boiling their leather belts or holster flaps in helmets, drinking the brown sludge in a desperate attempt to trick their stomachs. The search for food becomes more important than the enemy, leading to fatal fights between comrades over handfuls of moldy rice found in abandoned packs. The pack animals that were supposed to carry supplies become the only source of protein for the retreating columns. Oxen and mules that collapse from exhaustion are set upon instantly by starving soldiers with bayonets. The carcasses are butchered raw in the rain, with men consuming the meat before it can even be cooked, leading to further outbreaks of disease. The smell of rotting animal flesh mixes with the stench of human waste and gangrene, creating a miasma that hangs heavy in the humid air. The route of the retreat can be smelled by the pursuing British scouts long before it can be seen. Discipline, the iron backbone of the Japanese military, fractures under the weight of biological necessity. Officers who once commanded absolute loyalty now find themselves ignored or abandoned if they cannot keep up the pace. The camaraderie of the squad level dissolves into a ruthless survival of the fittest. When a soldier falls, his comrades no longer stop to help him up. They simply step around him, averting their eyes to avoid the guilt. The sick are left by the side of the trail, sometimes given a single hand grenade by their officers and told to do the honorable thing before the enemy arrives. The rivers that must be crossed to reach safety transform from geographical barriers into mass graves. The Yu and the Chindwin, swollen by weeks of continuous rain, rage with violent currents that can sweep away a healthy man, let alone a starving skeleton. There are no bridges, and the few boats available are reserved for the highest-ranking officers and the most critical equipment. The infantry must swim or cling to makeshift rafts of bamboo. Hundreds are swept away in the brown torrents, their screams lost in the roar of the water, their bodies destined to wash up on sandbars miles downstream. The British 14th Army follows the retreat, but they keep a cautious distance, letting the jungle do the killing for them. The East African and Indian divisions moving down the Kabar Valley are appalled by the scenes they encounter. They find Japanese soldiers sitting by the side of the road, staring blankly ahead, too weak to even raise a weapon in self-defense. The Allied troops, hardened by years of brutal warfare, are nevertheless silenced by the sheer scale of the misery. They see the evidence of an army that has cannibalized itself, finding bodies with flesh stripped away not by animals, but by fellow men. Allied air power ensures that even the weather offers no true sanctuary for the retreating columns. When the clouds break momentarily, hurricanes and thunderbolts swoop down to strafe the congested trails. The Japanese have no anti-aircraft guns left and no energy to run for cover. They simply trudge on through the strafing runs, accepting death with a fatalistic indifference. The pilots report that the enemy does not even scatter, appearing like a column of ants that simply closes ranks when one is stomped out. It is a slaughter of the helpless, a grim necessity of war that leaves the aviators shaken. The field hospitals established along the retreat route are hospitals in name only. In reality, they are morgues for the living. There are no medicines, no bandages, and no doctors capable of performing surgery. The wounded are laid out on banana leaves in the mud, waiting for the end amidst the screams of the delirious. Medical officers, helpless to intervene, can only offer water or assist in suicides. The decision of who gets to be carried and who is left behind is made not based on rank, but on weight and the likelihood of survival. The heavy casualties are abandoned to their fate. A psychological numbness settles over the survivors, a dissociation from reality that allows them to function amidst the horror. They stop speaking to one another, moving in a trance-like state where the only focus is the placement of the next footstep. The memories of home, of family, and of imperial glory fade away, replaced by the singular, reptilian drive to continue breathing. They are no longer soldiers of the emperor. They are biological entities, moving instinctively away from pain and death. The human spark within them is dimming, snuffed out by the relentless oppression of the green hell. As they push deeper into the valley, the distinction between the living and the dead blurs completely. Men sleep next to corpses without noticing, too exhausted to move the bodies. The trail becomes paved with the fallen, and in the deep mud. The living sometimes tread upon the dead to find purchase. The jungle, with its accelerated cycle of decay, begins to reclaim the bodies almost immediately. Vines grow over motionless limbs, and the mud swallows torsos, erasing the evidence of the tragedy as it happens. The Japanese army is vanishing into the landscape. By the time the remnants of the division approach the Chindwin crossings, they are unrecognizable as human beings. They are skeletal figures coated in mud, their eyes sunken deep into their skulls, their uniforms hanging in tatters. They have traversed the green hell, but they have not escaped it. They carry the horror within them, a trauma that has shattered their minds as thoroughly as the British artillery shattered their bunkers. The retreat through the monsoon has ended, but the legacy of the Road of Bones is just being written in the corpses they left behind. The path of retreat leading away from the Imphal Plain has acquired a grim new name among the survivors of the 15th Army Times, Hakotsu Kaido *, or the Road of Bleached Bones. It is a title that requires no poetic imagination to understand, for the evidence lies scattered in the mud for mile after agonizing mile. The route is paved not with gravel or stone, but with the discarded equipment of a broken empire and the bodies of its sons. As the weeks of the monsoon drag on, the jungle track becomes a linear graveyard where the dead are left unburied to rot in the open air. The sheer number of corpses transforms the landscape, creating markers of death that guide those who follow behind. For the soldiers of the British 14th Army pursuing the Japanese, the advance is a journey into a heart of darkness that shocks even the most battle-hardened veterans. Scouts from the East African and Indian divisions move cautiously through the bamboo, their weapons raised, only to lower them in revulsion at the scenes they discover. They find Japanese soldiers sitting upright against trees, rifles across their knees, appearing to be asleep until the scouts get closer. Only then do they realize that the men are dead, their eyes eaten away by insects, their bodies rigidly frozen in a final posture of exhaustion. The smell of the times Hakotsu Kaido times is a physical force that assaults the senses long before the visual horror comes into focus. It is a thick, cloying stench of decomposition, gangrene, and dysentery that hangs heavy in the humid jungle air. Unmoving in the windless valleys, Allied tank crews driving Lee and Grant tanks have to tie handkerchiefs soaked in gasoline around their faces to keep from vomiting inside their steel hulls. The odor permeates everything, clinging to uniforms and equipment, a constant reminder that they are moving through a corridor of mass death. Along the muddy verges of the trail, the tragedy of the Japanese medical system is laid bare in horrifying detail. Makeshift aid stations, abandoned in the panic of the retreat, are filled with the skeletons of men who were too weak to move and were left behind by their comrades. Some of these men clutch hand grenades to their chests, having chosen self-determination rather than capture, blowing holes in their own bodies. Others simply died of thirst or starvation where they lay, their skeletal hands still reaching out toward empty canteens that hold only rainwater and mud. The flies are the undisputed masters of this domain. Swarming in black clouds that sound like distant machinery, they cover the faces of the living and the dead alike, feasting on the open tropical ulcers that plague nearly every Japanese soldier. The men are so depleted of energy that they no longer have the strength to brush the insects away. They march with faces coated in bluebottles, breathing them in through cracked lips, existing in a state of apathy where the sensation of insects crawling on their skin no longer registers as discomfort. Maggots become a gruesome feature of daily existence for the retreating troops, infesting wounds while the soldiers are still walking. In the absence of antiseptics or bandages, the larvae infest the necrotic flesh of gangrenous limbs, eating the rotting tissue. While this macabre natural process actually saves some men from blood poisoning by cleaning the wounds, the psychological impact of seeing one's own body being consumed by worms is devastating. It strips away the last vestiges of human dignity, reducing the soldiers to the status of decomposing matter while they still draw breath. The camaraderie that bound the Imperial Army together in victory has largely disintegrated under the ruthless calculus of survival. On the Times Hakotsu Kaido *, the bond between soldiers is severed by the necessity of self-preservation. When a man falls in the mud, unable to rise, his squad mates do not stop to lift him. To stop is to waste precious energy. To carry a wounded man is a death sentence for the bearer. The fallen are left with a muttered apology or a bow, abandoned to the jungle and the approaching enemy. The cries of "help me" fade into the background noise of the rain, ignored by men whose entire world has narrowed to the next step. Starvation drives men to acts that defy the civilized imagination, pushing them across the boundaries of human behavior. Rumors of cannibalism whisper through the ranks, spoken of only in hushed, fearful tones. While rare, the evidence found by Allied troops suggests that in the deepest desperation, flesh was taken from the newly dead to sustain the living. More commonly, soldiers are found dead with their mouths stuffed with grass, mud, or raw roots, their digestive systems blocked by indigestible matter in a final, futile attempt to quell the agony of an empty stomach. The equipment of a modern army lies rusting in the mire, a testament to the total collapse of Mutaguchi's logistics. The trail is littered with Type 99 rifles, Nambu light machine guns, and helmets that have been cast aside by men too weak to carry them. Artillery pieces, once the pride of the regiment, sit bogged down to their axles, their breeches rusted shut. The soldiers have shed everything but the rags on their backs, trading their ability to fight for a slightly better chance of walking another mile. The 15th Army has effectively disarmed itself. British patrols often encounter living skeletons who are too far gone to offer any resistance or even acknowledge the enemy's presence. These Japanese soldiers stumble past the Allied troops like sleepwalkers, their minds completely shattered by the trauma of the retreat. The British and Indian soldiers, often instructed to take prisoners for intelligence, find themselves acting more as hospice workers than captors. They offer cigarettes and water to men who stare through them with thousand-yard stares. Men who have already crossed the threshold of death and are merely waiting for their bodies to catch up. The psychological toll on the 14th Army soldiers who must clear this road is immense. Despite their victory, the hatred they felt for the brutal invader dissipates into a mixture of pity and revulsion at the sheer scale of the suffering. Seeing the enemy reduced to such a primal, wretched state robs the victory of its glory. There is no triumph in marching over the bodies of men who died of starvation. There is only the grim task of bulldozing the corpses off the track to allow the supply trucks to pass. Specific tragedies play out in the mud, vignettes of horror that are seared into the memories of the survivors. A soldier might find his own brother or village friend by the side of the road, dying of dysentery. The constraints of the retreat allow for no sentimentality. There is no time for a burial or a long goodbye. A sip of water, a hand on the shoulder, and the healthy man must walk away, leaving his kin to die alone in a foreign land. The guilt of these moments will haunt the survivors for decades, a silent burden carried long after the war ends. Nature itself seems to conspire against the retreating army, erasing them from the earth with terrifying speed. The jungle grows with ferocious vitality during the monsoon, sending vines and creepers to wrap around the stationary bodies within hours. The mud acts as quicksand, swallowing men who sit down to rest and lack the strength to pull themselves free. The Times Hakotsu Kaido Times is not just a road, it is a digestive tract of the earth, consuming the army that dared to trespass against it. As the remnants of the columns near the Chindwin River, the density of the dead increases, creating a bottleneck of horror. This was the final hurdle, and for thousands, it was one step too far. Bodies are piled up at the choke points where the trails narrow, men who died waiting for a turn to cross that never came. The survivors stepping over them do not look down. They keep their eyes fixed on the grey water of the river ahead, the boundary line between the hell they have survived and the uncertain future that awaits them on the other bank. The legacy of the Road of Bones is written not in military histories, but in the silence of the jungle that reclaimed the 15th Army. It stands as the ultimate indictment of a command structure that valued abstract spirit over physical reality. For the thousands who perished on this track, there was no glory, no decisive battle, and no honorable death in combat. There was only the rain, the hunger, and the lonely, agonizing end on a muddy track far from home. The Times Hakotsu Kaido Times remains their unmarked grave. August 1944 marks the final tragic act of the Imphal campaign as the tattered remnants of the Japanese 15th Army stumble back to the banks of the Chindwin River. 5 months ago, they crossed this same waterway with the swagger of conquerors, their packs full of rice and their heads filled with dreams of marching on Delhi. Now, they return as a procession of ghosts, unrecognizable even to themselves. The broad, brown expanse of the river, which once represented the starting line of their glorious adventure, now serves as the finish line of a death march that has consumed the heart of the Imperial Japanese Army in Burma. The crossing itself is a chaotic and desperate affair, lacking the military precision that defined the initial invasion. There are few boats remaining, most having been destroyed by Allied air attacks or lost to the swollen currents of the monsoon. The survivors, many too weak to stand, are piled onto bamboo rafts that bob precariously in the turbulent water. Others, driven by a final burst of adrenaline, attempt to swim the distance, only to have their strength fail them halfway across. The Chindwin claims hundreds more victims in these final days. Dragging men down into its murky depths within mere yards of the safety they marched hundreds of miles to reach. The statistics of the catastrophe are numbing in their scale, representing the worst defeat on land in Japanese history up to this point in the war. Of the nearly 85,000 men who marched into India under Mutaguchi's command, barely 20,000 return as effective soldiers. Over 30,000 lie dead in the jungles of Kohima, the plains of Imphal, and along the Road of Bones. Tens of thousands more are rendered invalids, their bodies ravaged by malaria, dysentery, and starvation to a point of no return. The 15th Army has not just been defeated, it has been biologically dismantled, ceasing to exist as a fighting force. Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, the architect of this disaster, faces a reckoning that is both swift and shameful. On August 30, 1944, he is relieved of command and recalled to Tokyo in disgrace. Yet, true to his delusional nature, he refuses to accept responsibility for the slaughter of his men. To the end of his days, he blames the failure on the lack of spirit of his subordinates and the caution of his superiors, never acknowledging that his own logistical incompetence was the true killer. He escapes the firing squad, but he cannot escape the judgment of history, which brands him as one of the most incompetent commanders of the Second World War. For Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, the man who defied orders to save his division, the aftermath is a bitter mix of vindication and silence. He is initially threatened with a court-martial for mutiny, a charge that carries the death penalty. However, the Japanese High Command realizes that a public trial would expose the criminal negligence of Mutaguchi and the total collapse of the 15th Army to the public. To avoid this national embarrassment, the charges are quietly dropped, and Sato is forced into retirement. He saves his men from starvation, but his career is sacrificed on the altar of preserving the Imperial Army's face. On the other side of the lines, Lieutenant General William Slim and the British 14th Army stand as the undisputed masters of the battlefield. They have achieved what many thought impossible, destroying a major Japanese army in the jungle. Slim's strategy of the hammer and anvil has been vindicated completely. The victory at Imphal and Kohima does more than just save India. It shatters the myth of Japanese invincibility that had persisted since the fall of Singapore. The British and Indian troops now know that the supermen of the Imperial Army can be beaten, starved, and broken by superior tactics and logistics. The strategic consequences of the Yugo offensive's failure are catastrophic for the Japanese Empire in Southeast Asia. By expending its reserves in a futile gamble, Japan has left the door to Burma wide open. There are no fresh divisions to replace the skeletons that crawled back across the Chindwin. The 14th Army, resupplied and morale boosted, is already preparing for its own offensive. Operation Capital. They will cross the river not as raiders, but as liberators, driving south toward Mandalay and Rangoon. Mutaguchi's march on Delhi has inadvertently paved the way for the total Allied reconquest of Burma. The hospitals in the Japanese rear areas are scenes from a nightmare, overwhelmed by the sudden influx of thousands of dying men. There are no medicines to treat the tropical ulcers that expose bone, no plasma for the severe malnutrition, and no beds for the sheer volume of patients. Men die by the hundreds on the floors of makeshift wards, their bodies wasted away to less than 80 pounds. The medical staff, traumatized by their inability to help, can often do nothing more than bear witness to the final agonies of a generation of young men sacrificed for an impossible dream. The psychological scars of the campaign run as deep as the physical ones for the survivors. The men of the 15th Army have seen humanity stripped down to its rawest, most savage elements. They have witnessed cannibalism, the abandonment of comrades, and the total collapse of the moral order. These white ants, as they are sometimes called, hollowed out from the inside, will carry the silence of the jungle with them for the rest of their lives. They return to a homeland that is increasingly under siege, bearing the secret knowledge that the war is already lost. Globally, the disaster in Burma coincides with other pivotal moments that signal the end of the Axis powers. While the 15th Army was dying on the Road of Bones, the Allies were landing in Normandy, and the Americans were seizing Saipan. The ring is closing around Japan from all sides. The loss of Burma removes a critical buffer zone for the Japanese sphere of co-prosperity, exposing the resource-rich territories of Malaya and Thailand to Allied attack. The dominoes that began to fall at the tennis court in Kohima will eventually lead to the surrender in Tokyo Bay. The legacy of the battle remains etched into the landscape of the Indo-Burmese border for decades to come. The jungle eventually reclaims the tanks, the trucks, and the bunkers, covering the scars of war with a blanket of green. But the bones remain. For years after the war, local Naga villagers and search parties continue to find the bleached remains of Japanese soldiers along the jungle tracks. The Times, Hakotsu Kaido Times, serves as a silent, enduring memorial to the folly of unchecked ambition and the terrible price paid by the common soldier. In the end, the Yugo offensive serves as a brutal lesson in the immutable laws of warfare. It proved that spirit alone cannot conquer geography, that willpower cannot replace calories, and that an army without a supply line is nothing more than a gathering of armed refugees. The tragedy of the 15th Army is not just that they died, but that they died for nothing. Their suffering achieved no strategic goal, bought no time, and saved no ground. It was a harvest of death sown by arrogance and reaped by the monsoon. As the sun sets over the Chindwin River in late 1944, the water flows on. Indifferent to the history it has witnessed, the screams of the Banzai charges have faded, replaced by the buzzing of cicadas and the call of tropical birds. The war has moved on, rolling south toward the plains of Mandalay. But in the bamboo thickets and the muddy ravines of the Kabar Valley, the silence is heavy with the presence of the fallen. The road of bones is empty now, but the story of those who walked it serves as a grim warning to the future, whispering from the dark heart of the jungle.